Shalom, I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to look at the current situation with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, as well as examine and analyze the situation in Syria and the ultimate prospects for war. And then we're going to give you a background of the conflict and share with you that ultimately the battle in Syria is an Islamic war that is being waged between the majority Sunnis and the Alawite sect of Bashar Assad, which is a minority sect of Shiite Islam. First, the situation with the peace process. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton said that Israel building Jewish homes in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is a greater problem in the Middle East than what is happening in Syria and Iran. In any future peace agreement with the Palestinians, she said that Jerusalem should be divided. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas continues to threaten going to the United Nations General Assembly to gain recognition by the nations of the world for a Palestinian state. In order to try to prevent this from happening, United States Middle East envoy David Hale will be traveling to the Middle East this week, presenting new ideas for renewing peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians are saying that if the U.S. efforts fail to restart the peace talks, that they will go to the United Nations General Assembly for recognition of a Palestinian state based upon 67 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital in September. The situation in Syria is dramatically escalating. The opposition group, the Syrian Free Army, engaged in attacks against the Syrian government in Damascus. As a result, the Syrian government has decided to mount a military offensive against the opposition to bring an end to the conflict once and for all. Assad was warned by Russia that if the coming counterinsurgency targeting the opposition is not successful in the next 4 to 6 weeks, Syria should be prepared for a war from international intervention by the West. The United States Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, threatened war against Syria. British Foreign Secretary William Hague said that Britain might send troops to Syria. In any event, the Syrian government is making progress against the opposition. Showing concern for the situation, U.S. President Barack Obama has ordered the U.S. Navy and Air Force to accelerate preparations for a limited air offensive against the Assad regime and the imposition of no-fly zones over Syria. Their mission will be to knock out Assad's central regime and military command centers so as to shake regime stability and restrict Syrian Army and Air Force activity for subduing rebel action and wreaking violence on civilian populations. Furthermore, the United States and Britain, as well as France, initiated a UN Security Council motion for military intervention in Syria. China opposed the motion, saying that it was one-sided. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton harshly condemned Russia for supplying weapons to Syria, accusing them of sending attack helicopters to Syria to help Assad. Furthermore, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the General Staff to work out a plan for military operations outside Russia, including in Syria. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton set a mid-July deadline for the Kofi Annan peace plan to be implemented. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Russia is ready to host an international conference on Syria to discuss peaceful settlement to the Syrian crisis. Russia believes an international conference on Syria should be held under the umbrella of the United Nations and should bring together the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, along with Syria's neighbors, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, and also Qatar and Saudi Arabia, as well as the League of Arab States and the European Union. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Gennady Gatilov has said that Iran has a full right to mediate in the Syrian conflict. So we see that as the opposition in Syria is making an offensive against the Assad government, that he has decided to make a counter offensive against them. And Assad has the support of Russia, China, and Iran, and the opposition in Syria has the support of the United States, the European Union, and the Arab League. Therefore, the battle in Syria is a divide between East and West over the issue. Debka, an Israeli news and intelligence gathering service, reports that according to the semi-official Iranian news agency Fars, that a joint Russian, Chinese, Iranian exercise is to take place in Syria, and it's being labeled as the biggest of its kind ever staged in the Middle East, with 90,000 personnel, 400 airplanes, and 900 tanks taking part in the exercise. As part of its preparations, China is reported to have asked Egyptian authorities to permit the passage through the Suez Canal in late June of 12 naval ships heading to the Syrian port of Tartus, where Russia maintains a naval and marine base. Debka reported earlier that Russian naval vessels with Marines on board were heading to Tartus. If this military exercise does indeed take place, which is planned for later on in June or the first part of July, this would be the first time that a substantial Russian and Chinese military strength has ever been deployed in Syria or anywhere else in the Middle East. It means that Russia and China are prepared to parade their unabashed partnership with the Iranian and Syrian armies for the shared purpose of obstructing a coalition of the United States, European Union, and the Arab League, who is also seeking to militarily intervene in Syria. A large-scale Russian and Chinese military presence in Syria would expect to deter the United States from leading a military operation and establish a no-fly zone against Bashar Assad and the Syrian government. This large-scale maneuver was announced in Iran on the first day of the nuclear crisis talks in Russia between Iran and the 6 world powers. No progress was made in those talks. However, they have agreed to meet again in the first part of July in Istanbul, Turkey. Actually, what is happening in Syria is there is a conflict between the majority Sunnis, who are the opposition, and the ruling Shiites, and a sect of Shiite Islam, the Alawite sect, from which is Bashar Assad. And so in order to fully understand the situation in Syria, I would like to share with you an article that comes from the Huffington Post, and the article explains that Syria is a battleground between Sunnis and Shiites. Now, of all the Muslims in the world, 85% are Sunnis and 15% are Shiites. And the Arab world is dominated by Sunnis, and most of the Shiites live in the Iran area. And so in explaining this battleground, the article states the following: Syria has become the battleground between the Sunni and Shiite communities throughout the Middle East. The Syrian uprising has drawn a clear sectarian line: the Sunni axis led by Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and the Shiite axis led by Iran. The new political order that will eventually emerge in Syria will determine not only the ultimate success or failure of Iran's aspiration to become the region's power, but whether or not the Sunni Arab world will maintain its dominance. Hence, the conflict will be long, costly, and bloody, reflecting the troubled history between the two sides that has extended for over 1,000 years. History may not repeat itself, but it remains instructive. The Sunni-Shiite schism goes back more than 1,000 years, starting with the dispute over the Islamic Caliphate following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 and carrying through to the conflict between the Shiite Safavid dynasty in Persia and the Sunni Ottoman dynasty in Turkey in the 16th and 17th centuries. This conflict has in fact shaped the geography of Shiite Islam to this very day. There is no greater evidence of the intense conflict between the Sunnis and the Shiites than the violent clash in Bahrain, where Saudi Arabia directly interfered militarily to quell the Shiite uprising to ensure continued Sunni dominance. However small Bahrain is, it represents a microcosm of the Sunni-Shiite conflict that has engulfed the Middle East. The Sunni insurgency in Iraq continues to terrorize the Shiite majority, resulting in a weekly death of dozens of innocent civilians on both sides. The Shiites' Hezbollah group in Lebanon continues to support the Syrian government's violent crackdown on its citizens, killing by most estimates more than 10,000 people. Sunni Hamas, which has enjoyed financial and military support from Iran, while simultaneously receiving political and logistical support from Assad's Alawite regime, which is an offshoot of Shiite Islam, has left its headquarters in Damascus and now openly condemns the Syrian authorities' bloodletting against its Sunni population. At greater stake in Syria is the national interest of Saudi Arabia as the conservative leader of the Arab Sunni world. A consolidation of Iran's grip over Syria would transcend the Shiite influence over the entire crescent of landmass between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. Though Saudi Arabia paid not much heed to Saddam Hussein's ultimate fate, handling Iraq to Shiite Iran on a golden platter in the wake of the Iraq War of 2003 was and remains deeply troubling to Saudi Arabia. It is critical for Saudi Arabia to pull Syria out of Iran's grip, which explains why the Saudi government is supportive of arming the rebels in Syria in the hope of toppling Bashar Assad. Moreover, there is no love lost between Iran and the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a regional Islamic Sunni movement whose local parties will dominate the countries of Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia. Although all three countries are undergoing a difficult transitional process, they would cheer the collapse of the Assad regime and would do whatever they could to support the emergence of a Sunni government in Syria. As international sanctions begin to bite and the Iranian leadership begins to feel the pain, they agreed to re-engage in negotiations with the P5, that is the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and Germany over their nuclear program. Equally motivating to Iran, however, is the situation in Syria. The deteriorating conditions of Syria and Iran's nuclear issues have become intertwined because of the Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapons is driven not merely by national security considerations, but essentially by Iran's desire to secure nuclear weapons to bolster its regional power. Assad's Syria is key to this strategy, and its fall would further increase Iran's isolation in a mostly Sunni neighborhood and cut the direct links between Iran and its Hezbollah ally in Lebanon. Also, once Assad's Syria is unraveled, the current substantial Iranian influence on Iraqi politics would weaken at a much quicker pace. Therefore, we can see that the situation in Syria is more than a democracy and a freedom movement. Syria is now the battleground for influence in the Middle East. Between East and West, the coalition of the United States, the European Union, the Arab League versus the Russian, China, and Iranian axis, as well as Syria being the center now of the over 1,000-year-old conflict in the Muslim world between the Shiites and the Sunnis. Well, that's going to conclude this week's update. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.